The Second International Brass Congress attracted many of Arnold Jacobs' students. Some appeared as featured soloists, and they all truly represented the legacy of this great master. We spoke with several of them in the lobby of the Musical Arts Center between sessions, and I would like to share some of these conversations with you. I'm talking with Dick Erb, who's the bass trombone player of the New Orleans Orchestra and also a teacher, teaches at Loyola University and the National Youth Orchestra of Canada. Dick studied with Arnold Jacobs later in his career after he was already a professional, which is a little different than most people who would be studying with teachers, and we thought we might inquire about some of the influence of Arnold Jacobs' teaching and influence perhaps psychological on your career and on your musical talents and so forth. Would you like to speak to?
I certainly would. I'm grateful for any opportunity to speak about Mr. Jacobs and how he's helped me and affected my life. I did go to him late in life, relatively. I was 29 years old. I was already a professional player. And I think that he really made it possible for me to continue to do that, where it was something that was getting harder rather than easier for a while, I think. And as far as the psychology goes of what he's done, there are 2 or 3 different ways you can approach that. A lot of what people talk about when they mention psychology with respect to brass teaching comes down to it's always the power of positive thinking, in a sense. It's encouragement, it's developing self-confidence. And clearly he helped me in all of those areas, but that's not really the most significant thing to me. Because when I think of psychology as a term and Mr. Jacobs, I think of one of the other aspects of that word, which is the behavioral aspect and the scientific aspect. Certainly he was encouraging and supportive to all of his students, and very much so to me. And I gained a lot of confidence from my association with him. But I think more interesting is the fact that this is a man who has a knowledge of behavioral scientific psychology, the behavioral aspects of psychology. And when he worked with me, the changes that he made in my playing, the changes were made by that method. And the interesting thing about it was that he was able to get into the responses that I was making to a given situation, and in a very systematic way interrupt those responses and replace them with more appropriate ones.
I have heard some criticism about perhaps his methods being too analytical. Would that be contradicted by what you just said?
I think it would, in a sense, because I don't think that the student has to understand intellectually what's going on at the moment. He does the analyzing. And as a matter of fact, he cautions you that you can't be the student and the teacher at the same time. That's one of his old favorites. And he makes it very clear that there's 2 tracks at work here, one coming in and one going out. And when you perform, when you operate your instrument, you should be performing. And your mindset should be on the outward track of communicating with your listener.
Was there a special purpose that reason that you had in going to him in the first place?
Yeah, I was having some sound production problems, I think is what you'd best call them. I thought at least I had a very good idea of what it was I was trying to do and how I wanted to sound. I had good models. I had, I thought, a good background in music, but a lot of times getting that as a result, getting that as a product, I wasn't succeeding in doing that. I had a couple specific things. Was one with just simply beginning notes, what we call attacks in brass playing, in a very general kind of way, were sometimes difficult to make speak when I thought artistically they were supposed to be. And I couldn't understand why. I had no idea why this was happening. I had a lot of good advice. None of it seemed to help. But he was able to look exactly at my performing, find the point in the response that wasn't working right, and change it in a very, very short time. He did this by essentially understanding the physiology of the body and how your psychological system motivates that.
You were already an advanced player with
Yeah, more or
musical
less.
skills.
I was working.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Dick. I really
Thank you.
appreciated talking to you. Thank you. We're speaking now with Bob Karen from Los Angeles. Bob is with the Los Angeles Brass and a freelancer in the area and has been a recent student of Arnold Jacobs. You're still taking some lessons with him, I guess?
In fact, as soon as the conference is over, I'm planning another side trip up to Chicago to have another brush-up lesson.
Very
I pretty much
ambitious.
do it every year or twice a year if I can make it. I
That's
try
wonderful.
to get out to Chicago and see him. And I started studying with him around 1976, I believe it was, after I finished 3 years in Venezuela. I played in Maracaibo, Venezuela, and this was after Juilliard and everything, and all that time I was playing well, but I wasn't comfortable with it. Pretty much when I came back from Venezuela, I had in the back of my mind that if it didn't become more comfortable, if I wasn't happier playing, that I was really going to have to start looking for something else. And I remember that first lesson, Jake said, you know, it sounded like I was wheezing. He said, maybe you have lung disease or something. And it turned out that after that first lesson, the next couple of days later when I went back for the next one, things started to open up and I started feeling better. And I also feel that when he looked right at me, he said, now I'm your friend, you can make mistakes, go ahead. I just relaxed, started to relax, and for the first time I started to really feel good when I played. And the thing that I find now that I'm enjoying so much about is I'm able to sit down in a concert situation and just see the music and just project the image of that music. I don't really feel much in terms of the mechanics of the instrument
Right.
or my surroundings.
So the mechanics are important as a learning tool or something, but in the actual performance, they're...
Yeah, and that's the thing that is nice about his teaching is that although he will work with you on mechanics and that sort of thing, near the end of the lesson he'll always say, now forget about that stuff. I don't want to talk about how you took a breath or something. He says, now you just make music, you know. And I think that over the last few years he has been emphasizing that aspect more and more and more, and maybe de-emphasizing as much the emphasis on the respiratory things and all that. He talks about those things still, but he really is using the brain as the leader much more now. And I found that it really helps me in almost every aspect of my life. I'm much happier about everything because of this, you know.
Other than music things?
Yeah, I found I just have more confidence about myself as a person, and he, in a funny way, he really made a big change in my life, because when I had to make a decision about staying in Sacramento or not, I came to see him, and one lesson we spent just talking about the situation. He says, well, he thought I should take the risk, go to L.A. And I said, well, but there's a girl in Sacramento. And he says, well, marry her. And I said, well, I didn't think she was just going to marry me like that. And he said, well, get her pregnant. And I said, well, but she's a nurse. He says, oh, well, then she probably wouldn't get pregnant that easily. As it turns out, we got married, moved to L.A., and I've got a 9-month-old baby. So,
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Bob. That's been very, very interesting. I'm talking now to Dan Parentoni, who is the are you professor? Professor at Arizona State in Tempe, Arizona. And Dan is a longtime student of Arnold Jacobs, very famous soloist and artist, and but I guess primarily a teacher as far as your profession is concerned. Yes. At this point. How have you been able to use the methods you learned from Mr. Jacobs in your teaching?
Almost exclusively. You know, I learned so much from Mr. Jacobs. When I first went to him, I was a very physical player, and he isolated, you know, the physical sense of my playing, got me very comfortable, so I don't have to think about it. And so I'm just concerned with the doer. And I treat my students basically the same way. When they come in, we try to get the physical problem solved, separate it from the main goal, which is making music. And as soon as I get involved in making music, it seems to be very successful. So I work almost parallel with what he does.
That's wonderful. Now, your career, you studied with him when you were at the...
I studied with him later on in life. I should say later on when I had my first job at the University of Illinois. I knew I needed some help because, again, I was a very physical player, missing a lot of notes and things like that. I went to Mr. Jacobs when I took that job.
How old were you then, Dan?
I was 26 years old. And I had experience before that. I played in the Amsterdam Orchestra, in the Army Band, and some other things. And I was quite successful, but I knew I needed to get free of this physical phenomenon which was hindering my playing, I could say.
Now, was this this something that you sensed as a sensation in your body, a feeling, or in musical sound, or how?
I needed to extend my range, particularly my high range. I was having trouble with that, and I remember somebody said, "You should see Mr. Jacobs." And I heard so much about him. His reputation then was just terrific as it is now. And I had to go. If I wanted to be successful, I had to go with it. And my training was a lot like Mr. Jacobs in the sense that I never studied with anybody really till I got to college.
Now, in your solo performing, which you do so much of and so well, how does his method directly relate to that? Is it something you consciously apply each time you pick up the horn, or?
Yes, I could express this when I played here at the convention, and you look out to all those wonderful artists out there, you can get really nervous, and he helped my concentration. You know, it's sort of like the inner game of tennis, where you're concerned with the doer, that you make up words when you're performing, that you're trying to communicate, not judging yourself. And the more I get into this theory that he gave me, the easier it becomes, where I'm concentrated on just doing it and not being so concerned of how I'm doing it.
This would help in audition situations or any stress?
Extremely, extremely. You know, if you can control that. Some days it works better than others.
Sure, of course, yeah. Would there be a single, if you were to pick out one thing from his teaching that has helped you the most, would there be any way to do that?
Other than the physical and being very relaxed and comfortable, it's knowing yourself. And he installed, I think, the most single important message. He says, listen, be concerned with the music. Making music is your main goal. Everything else I told you is helpful, but forget it when you're performing. I mean, forget thinking physically, but have good habits, good physical habits, and play, make music, whether it's jazz, whether it's anything.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. I'm talking with Steve Chenette, former first trumpet with the Minneapolis Symphony and now teacher at the University of Toronto. Steve has studied with Jacobs over a long period of time. When did you first start working with Mr. Jacobs, Steve?
In 1962, I was in my second year with the Minneapolis Orchestra. When I got to the orchestra, I noticed that there were some players that looked to me like natural players. They just did it so easily, the first trombone, the tuba, one of the trumpet players. And I realized that they had all studied with Jacobs, and I thought, I've got to try that. So in my second season in the orchestra, I called him up, scheduled a couple of lessons, and then never really stopped after that.
So you were already a very successful performer, and that's amazing.
I was 26 at the time. I had 6 years in orchestras to date, but he made a substantial difference in my playing. People in the orchestra who didn't know that I had started doing this would give me compliments on changes that they noticed in my playing.
Have you been able to utilize some of the things that he spoke to you about with your students?
Absolutely. The Jacobs approach is the foundation of my teaching. He offers an understanding of how brass playing works, and I try to, as much as I can, pass this on to the students to try to get them to stop blocking themselves, fighting themselves, to get them to function efficiently as a player so that the musical ideas can filter through as unimpeded as possible.
Sounds like a great deal of emphasis on the mental aspect of performing or of playing.
Well, that's of course the ultimate goal. In my own work with Jacobs, I had a lot of things to relearn.
How were you able to accomplish this while you were first trumpet in a major orchestra?
His approach is so clear and simple, and it goes with the body instead of against it. It made my work easier right from the beginning, and the more of his ideas that I could incorporate, the better. It was not a problem to try to work it in.
Amazing. And you have had good success with your students in picking up some of these things immediately. You can see it turn around right away in certain areas.
Yes, with certain problems, the improvement can be quite dramatic. You can make you, as a teacher, look like something of a miracle worker. Mm-hmm. I never failed to give credit to Jacobs for this.
This is Bob Tucci, who plays in Munich in the Bavarian State Opera Orchestra, the tuba player, and has been in Europe, in the European scene for many years. And we thought we might chat with him just a minute about the influence and the acceptability of Arnold Jacobs' methods in Europe. Now, you studied with Jacobs for quite a while you were...
I knew Jacobs before I actually met him by virtue of my first teacher, Harold McDonald,
oh, yes.
Pittsburgh, who was from Chicago and had studied with Mr. Jacobs after the war. And so I had considerable exposure to Mr. Jacobs' approach and philosophy of playing and his style of teaching by virtue of my first teacher. In 1962, I went to Vienna, Austria, and had the good fortune to be able to begin working with the Vienna Symphony Orchestra and later with the Vienna State Opera and the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra almost immediately after I got there. And those orchestras have a very strong musical tradition and a very unique style of brass playing, which was anything other than scientific. It was mostly oriented, or very strongly oriented toward the repertoire that they play, their concept of sound, no problem, a very hard attack, one thing and another.
Even the instruments they use.
And also the instruments they use. And Mr. Jacobs' training at that time was a very scientifically oriented as a medium to get his ideas in the flesh and blood of making music. And this is something which was very unique to the people that I worked with and was exposed to there. It was two different worlds. Here was one world where musical performance was dictated by a very strong tradition, and the actual practice of playing had been given almost no consideration whatsoever. And Mr. Jacobs' highly analytical approach to teaching that analyzed the music, the actual physical and psychological motions of making music, and also all of the physical and psychological motions of actually producing the sounds involved. So at that time, any mention or one thing I might have made around my colleagues in Vienna was almost not even welcomed. You know, they thought it was very strange, the things I was talking about. Now, I've been there almost 25 years, and I think the first group or country of European players to accept and welcome Mr. Jacobs' ideas would have been the English, because of traditional ties and also of the lack of a language barrier. And it seemed that the English were able to move their traditional style of playing into a more modern school of actual tone production sooner than others. This spread across Scandinavia and eventually, of course, throughout all of Europe now, so that you have many people who come from Europe to Chicago or to Indiana University or to the Curtis Institute.
Well, that's very interesting, Bob. That's a very interesting concept on his influence.
European brass playing has benefited very strongly by this exposure to American concepts of brass playing, by all means.
Talking now to Mark Lawrence, who's the first trombone player in the San Francisco Symphony. Mark has studied some with Mr. Jacobs and uses his approach. You actually use his approach in your own playing at this time. Do you find it effective in playing in the San Francisco Symphony?
Very definitely.
Is it something you're conscious of in performance or in preparation?
Yes, very definitely. I first, of course, got a taste of this when I was studying with you at the Curtis Institute, and with the few lessons I had with Mr. Jacobs, what I found especially helpful was the fact that most of our lives, as we're learning to play our instruments, we're taught to think about what we're doing, and this has its advantages and its drawbacks. And the drawbacks sometimes are that by thinking about what you're doing, you forget to let the body kind of do what it has to do to produce the desired result without you trying to control what's happening as far as muscular functions or what the armature should be doing or what your diaphragm should be doing. And I found that his method of imparting visualization to a player and thinking of the desired result as opposed to necessarily spending too much time worrying about how to get that result. I found that especially helpful in my teaching, because a lot of times before I would try and tell a student how to do something to help him solve a problem instead of getting him to think of something like how he wanted it to sound or visualize the phrase as you would visualize a tennis ball going into the opposite court when you serve it.
So even with elementary, almost beginning students or young players at least?
Well, he told me in one of the lessons, he said, give me a 5-year-old any day as opposed to a 25-year-old, because they don't have any of this built-in excess baggage. So whereas a lot of professionals like myself hesitate taking younger students, I think it makes your job a little easier because they don't have a lot of these built-in prejudices. So sure, I think the younger a player can learn these kind of techniques, the better, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mark.
It's my pleasure.
We're speaking with Charlie Vernon, who's the bass trombone player of the Philadelphia Orchestra. Charlie has been quite successful in the last 10 or 12 years in audition taking, at least it appears on the surface, because last count I think you've won 3 major auditions in a stepping stone pattern up to the Philadelphia Orchestra. And you're, of course, a longtime student of Arnold Jacobs. Has there been a relationship between your success in audition taking and Mr. Jacobs' approach?
Oh, most definitely. It started when I first started studying with him. I was too young to really know, to grasp what he was saying, and it was so simple. But I went to him with thoughts of him turning me into the greatest trombone player in the world right away, showing me how to play and everything. And he told me the same things then as he told me throughout the duration of the studying with him, and today, you know, what we heard today. And it finally sunk in over a period of years. See, in the beginning, it took me several years to really understand what that man was saying. He has a way of, you know, these big long words and philosophizing and stuff, and I wasn't able to grasp on to just the simple concept of it until a little bit later. But the thing that happened later on in my career, when I started doing more and more, playing more and more recitals and playing in front of people a lot, was that I started treating the auditions like, preparing for an audition like I would prepare for a recital, and that I would buzz the excerpts, you know, and really sing the excerpts and buzz the excerpts like I would buzz a concerto or parts of a concerto.
Mouthpiece buzzing being a method of his primarily.
And the concept of having the song in your head and vocally singing it out, not with your vocal cords, but with the lips. When I started doing that more and more with the excerpts and treating that as I would walk on stage for a recital, which I'm not it doesn't. I'm real comfortable with that now. I think and I've finally bridged that. I finally made that made the audition happen like a recital.
Now speaking with Irving Hollingsworth and Keith Johnson. Irv is a tuba player in the Indianapolis area, a former public school teacher, and Keith teaches at the University of Northern Iowa, trumpet teacher and an author book on trumpet playing. We have a rather broad perspective on Arnold Jacobs here at this table because, Irv, you worked with Mr. Jacobs when he was in the Indianapolis Symphony back in the late 30s?
1937, when the orchestra reorganized under Dr. Fabian Savitsky. Arnold came out from Curtis Institute. That was his first major symphony job.
So he was just a Jacobs.
I started studying with him about 1980, and I've studied with him several times a year since that time.
He's elongated his ability and his academic approach and his books and his literature on it. I do remember, however, that he was a young, svelte, handsome gentleman, as you would expect, and could he get a powerhouse attack on that New York that he had then at that time?
The other thing that I find most influential is the way he has shown us how to take a complicated subject and distill it to its essence and try and get across that essence and not get bogged down in the details. So he's a very efficient teacher as well as being a very effective teacher and always musical.
I'm speaking with Ron Bishop, the tuba player of the Cleveland Orchestra, who's a longtime admirer and student and follower of Arnold Jacobs. Ron, would you call Arnold Jacobs a role model for your career as up to this point, or would that be a fair term?
Very definitely a fair term.
How has that come about?
Well, I think I first heard a recording of the Chicago Orchestra, and Mr. Jacobs was playing. I believe the recording was made in 1951, which goes back a few years. And I was very impressed with the sound that he made and his interpretive prowess. And I thought about him and listened to a lot of recordings, got to hear him live when they would come on tour, because I was stationed in Army, one of the Army Field Band in Washington. And got to meet him and listen to him live, and he's been a very strong influence in my life. I finally did get to take lessons with him about 8 years later in 1959. And I had a lesson with him just a little bit under 2 years ago. So he's still very strong influence. Okay. I keep trying to do it as easily as he does it.
Easily is an interesting word. I've heard many of his students speak about how they would like to play as easily as he, or how they walk away from a lesson thinking, why, that's so easy, why didn't I think of it myself?
Yes. Well, I was in real good shape physically when I first started working with him, and he always used to say, no, it's too much muscle, too much muscle. No, weakness, weakness. And still has to tell me the same thing. He said if it were hard work, I wouldn't be able to do it. Not with my problems.
His problems.
Yeah, with Mr. Jacobs' problems. He said I wouldn't be able to do it if it were hard. He says I'm an old man and I'm out of shape. I'm overweight. He said I couldn't do it if it was hard. I'm still trying to figure that out. I'd like it to be easy.
I remember once you presented a clinic at Indiana University called Music Not Muscle, which
Yes.
I thought was a very, very key phrase.
Yes, the subtitle I think was something like, "This will not be a lecture in loud."
Very good. Well, thank you for speaking with us, Ron, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.